So last week's episode ended with what to me at least seemed to be a rather remarkable statement by Camus. He had moved from what he had called the absurd in his earlier books, The Myth of Sisyphus and The Outsider, meaning the contemplation of the fact that we have a short life, we come to the end of it and there is just nothing beyond that. Our whole consciousness and existence as a person just vanishes into nothing. And that one needs to rebel against that thought by criticising and trying to pull down this God who actually doesn't exist anyway, but should exist. And if he does, he should have made a better job of creating an eternal meaning for us. Anyway, so there's this meaninglessness, nothingness, and we have to rebel against that meaninglessness. And we do that, he says in the beginning of the current book, The Rebel, by living in total freedom, and that takes the form of living always for our own pleasure and only for our own pleasure, even though that may involve breaking the law and it may involve committing crimes. And then he was supposedly approving of the people that thought that way. Then he spoke about nihilism, particularly in regard to the 19th century revolutionaries, both the real and the fictional ones, in Russia, who wanted to reject any value, any human structure, any societal structure, just to demolish them all to make way for what was going to come, whatever that was. In Marx's case, it was what history was going to lead us into. So he led from that nothingness, sense of futility, I suppose, no value at all, that Camus had himself perceived, to the wanting to remove all value, which the nihilists were wanting to do. But then, having gone through all that, he had made this statement that all that sort of is really a kind of a slavery, and that real freedom is an inner submission to a value which defies history and its successes. So that just seems to be a huge shift, and I'm not quite sure if, when he wrote that sentence in the book, whether Camus himself realised what kind of a journey that implied that he'd been on, and whether he just wrote that sentence quickly without really contemplating it. But to me it seems as though that he's gone a great distance. Maybe he's become converted, I don't know. But that all came up in the context of his talking about what he called the individual revolutionaries, particularly those in Russia. And when he'd been speaking about the late 19th century bomb throwers who were trying to pull down the Tsar, and whom he called the fastidious assassins or the fastidious terrorists, he said that they had actually overcome nihilism because they still had and wanted to maintain certain values. But at the same time, he said nihilism nevertheless had survived them and had continued. And it went on to really be represented as in Leninism, which he saw as a combination of nihilism with Marxism. So nihilism wants to destroy, remove all values. Marxism wants to move into a society which is the fulfilment of the progress of history. So in Leninism, according to Camus, combines those two things. So it's an aggressive desire to destroy, pull everything down, just remove all the human societal structures to replace them with something different. But at the same time, there's a very well-organised, tightly knit, secretive, cohesive, revolutionary body, disciplined, but nevertheless constantly betraying, each member constantly betraying the other members at the same time, and in pursuit of some goal that they're following, which very much is very much depicted in the society that Dostoevsky wrote about in his novel The Possessed, that we've spoken about so many times and that Camus speaks about so many times, which actually was written before Lenin actually came on the scene, so it was quite prophetic. So this is so that was when Camus was talking about the individual terrorists. He went on to talk about what he calls state terrorism, particularly its irrational form, which in his mind was Hitler. And now he goes on to talk about state terrorism in what he calls its rational form. So, and basically he's talking about communism there. So he's mentioned Leninism, this blend of nihilism with Marxism. And then he wants to look at now particularly the Soviet Union, which was kind of, I suppose, the first major outworking of Marxist doctrine on a national societal level. So he says that Marx's writings contained both a kind of a critical analysis and also a kind of prophetic component to them. And I'm not quite sure what he really means by prophetic. I mean, that can mean a number of things. It implies something spiritual, I suppose, or supernatural. And he says that was somewhat suppressed later on. Interesting, he talks about the fact that in the Soviet Union, all of Marx and Engels' writings, which are very voluminous, were held there. And there was a thing called the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, which was systematically publishing all of the writings of Marx and Engels. But that in 1935, which was at the height of Stalin's time, they suddenly stopped publishing them, even though there was a great deal more that hadn't been released. And sort of wondering why that was, that they didn't bring any more of it out. And the implication is that Camus seems to be implying this, and others have as well, that there were elements to it that didn't really meet the requirements of that present Soviet regime. There were some unusual things, perhaps one might call prophetic. And interestingly, this is me again now rather than Camus talking, but there was a man called Richard Wurmbrand, I suppose, who was a Romanian, a Jew who became converted to Christianity, who suffered a lot of persecution under the Romanian communist regime in the 60s and 70s. And he wrote a book in which he revealed and quoted a lot of Marx's writings, which sound very much like the poetry of Shelley, and they're actually openly satanic, kind of praising Satan. And so Marx was definitely on that track. And perhaps that didn't suit the Soviet regime to have that publicised. So, speaking about these, what you might call prophetic elements to Marxism, Camus then compares the Marxist and the Christian and then the Greek view of human history. And he sees a lot of similarities between the Marxist and the Christian view, and that he says they're both linear. There's a beginning, there's a progression through a certain series of stages of development, and then we come to an end. And involved in that is some sort of punishment towards the end. There's a judgment of whether things have been done well or badly or rightly or wrongly, and some punishment has to be exacted. And in the process of that, he says, so with both Christian and Marxist view of history, he says that that process happens against the backdrop of nature, but is separate from nature. Nature has to be subjugated to allow this human history to carry on its course. So he compares that with the Greek view, which he says is more cyclical. So there isn't just a beginning and an end, a creation and a destruction, whatever, that he says is characteristic of both the Marxist and the Christian view. But he says in the Greek view it's a cyclical process. And he says there isn't really punishment involved. I'm not quite sure where he's getting those ideas from or what justification he has for them. But anyway, he says it as a cyclical thing without the punishment, and that it is in and of nature. So rather than subjugating nature to allow human history to move along its path, Camus says the Greek view is that it all happens within nature and is involved with that. So, on the other hand, there are elements of Marxism which are strictly materialistic. So we mentioned before, last week I think, that Marx's idea of the progression of history is kind of a subtype of Hegel's idea of a gradual evolution towards some ultimate, final condition or state that we don't really know or can't perceive, but we just know that we're heading towards it. But Camus makes the point that he distinguishes the two. I mean, in both cases, well, as we said before too, Hegel sees this progression as consisting of this, what he calls the dialectic, where one has a starting point, one is heading towards this undefined end point. We make steps forward gradually by approaching an intermediate point and making a compromise at that. That becomes the starting point for another step, and then by a series of these compromises, what he calls the dialectic, we gradually approach that end point. And so Camus says that in Hegel's case, that dialectic was moving towards some kind of spiritual goal, whereas Marx, he says, talked about what he called dialectic materialism. So we have that same dialectic progression, but the aims are strictly material, even though there was parts of Marx's writings which are quite prophetic, in inverted commas. So I don't know how Marx himself reconciled those two ideas, or whether he felt the need to try and reconcile them. But Camus seems to have noticed that there is a bit of a discrepancy there. So in Marx's case, the basic problem of history was that the workers, the proletariat, are separated from the means of production. The means of production are owned by the capitalists, and the goal is to remove those means of production from the capitalists and hand them over to the proletariat. And once they own and possess and control that means of production, then the workers' Marxist paradise will have been arrived at and achieved.